Britain's economy is under incredible strain.
Can't raise taxes, can't really let debt go much higher, and yet public services are crying out for more money.
Here, money isn't your only currency. Time is. You'll pay in hours to see a doctor, cross the city, or speak to a human. Welcome to London, a financial juggernaut. On paper, it's an economic titan. If it were a country, its economy would outrank Sweden, Argentina, and even the UAE. It's a hub for finance, insurance, legal services, and global capital. In many ways, it's still the crown jewel of British economic output. But here's the uncomfortable truth. London isn't Britain. Beyond the sleek skyline is a country quietly cracking beneath the weight of contradiction. Today, the UK is a paradox. Wages have been flat for 15 years, and rents are at record highs. How did everyday life become absurd? Once, Britain had a vibrant middle class, and the promise of modest homeownership, stable pensions, family holidays, and dignity in retirement. In 1990, over 65% of Britons self-identified as middle class. Today, that figure has dropped to just under 40% and falling. Because, in practice, the middle class is being hollowed out. If you earned an average income in 2007, you were just 8% worse off than your European neighbors. Today, that gap has tripled to 20%. Yet the average cost of living, rent, childcare, transport, has risen by over 25% in the same window. Home ownership among 25 to 34-year-olds has dropped from 59% in 2000 to just 28% in 2023. These aren't just statistics, they're symptoms of systemic erosion. Middle-class life used to be normal. Now, it's managed survival. The so-called affluent strugglers, those earning £40,000 to £70,000, are one emergency away from debt. 2/3 report financial stress. 1 in 5 use credit for basic needs. And when aspiration turns into quiet anxiety, when the middle tier can't rise and can't fall without breaking, that's no longer a class, that's a pressure point. If pay won't move, the engine beneath it isn't either. That engine is productivity. Before the 2008 financial crash, productivity in the UK was rising at nearly 2% annually, modest but steady. This was the mechanism behind rising wages, increasing living standards, and long-term economic health. But after 2008, something broke. Productivity growth didn't just slow, it flatlined. Today, Britain ranks in the bottom 10% of all OECD countries for productivity. So, what happened? Why did productivity collapse and stay down? The answer, unfortunately, is structural. It's not one decision. It's a pattern of chronic underinvestment. Since 2005, British companies have invested nearly 20% less than their counterparts in Germany, France, and the United States. It's not just that Britain isn't working harder, it's that it's not working smarter. Even basic business investment has been sluggish. In sectors like manufacturing and transport, capital spending has declined for over a decade. In the UK, the average investment in machinery and equipment per worker is far lower than in Germany. But here's the paradox. Britain has talent. It has world-class universities. It has research clusters in biotech, fintech, and advanced manufacturing. So why can't it capitalize on them? Because investment doesn't flow into these areas at scale. Venture capital is limited. Public funding for R&D is erratic, and government industrial policy incoherent at best, absent at worst. And while other countries emerged from the 2008 crisis by reinvesting in productivity, the UK went the other way. Austerity replaced stimulus. Cuts replaced planning. Short-termism replaced vision. Germany doubled down on apprenticeships and export infrastructure. The US launched tech hubs and research grants. Even France modernized its industrial base. Britain, it canceled training schemes, froze public sector wages, and relied on cheap labor to fill productivity gaps, rather than closing them. And so, what could have been a pause became a plateau, and what could have been a recovery became a reality. Today, productivity in the UK is not just an economic issue, it's a national emergency. Because without productivity growth, there is no wage growth. Without wage growth, there is no social mobility. And without social mobility, a generation is trapped. Let's talk about housing, because if there's one thing that defines the absurdity of life in the UK today, it's this. Britain has the highest rate of homelessness in the developed world. Yes, higher than the United States, higher than France, higher than Canada. As of 2023, over 309,000 people in England were recorded as homeless or living in temporary accommodation, a 14% increase from the previous year. Of those, 131,000 are children. So, how did it get this bad? Because Britain doesn't build enough homes, not even close. England builds 200,000 homes a year. It needs 300,000. The 100,000 gap every year compounds into scarcity you can feel. Rents at records, ownership out of reach. Meanwhile, the public housing stock has been decimated. The Right to Buy scheme, introduced in 1980, allowed tenants to purchase their council homes at a discount, but the government never replaced those units. Since 1980, the number of homes available for social rent in England has fallen by over 1.5 million, and in 2023, there were just 162,000 social homes available nationwide for an eligible population of over 1.2 million on the waiting list. So, where do people go? They turn to the private rental sector, where competition is fierce, conditions are often dire, and prices have spiraled out of control. The average monthly rent in London reached £2,627 in 2024, a record high. Even outside London, average rents in places like Manchester and Bristol have increased by over 25% since 2021. And for those hoping to buy, the average house price in the UK stands at over £285,000, but the average UK salary is just $34,963. That's one of the worst affordability ratios in Europe. In London, it's even worse, with average prices pushing £523,000 and a house price to income ratio of over 12 times. Shortage compounded into crisis. It is perhaps the clearest example of how a country can appear wealthy while simultaneously failing to provide its citizens with something as basic as a stable place to live. This crisis is also mirrored in the National Health Service, the NHS, once the pride of Britain, a symbol of fairness, of modern civilization, healthcare free at the point of use, available to all, respected worldwide. Today, that symbol is fractured. In 2014, NHS waiting lists stood at just under 3 million people. By 2023, that figure more than doubled, peaking at 7.4 million. That's 1 in every 9 people in England waiting for treatment. But here's the twist. NHS funding has gone up. Staffing has increased too. So why is the system still failing? Because demand is outpacing supply. The UK population is older than ever. By 2040, nearly 25% of the country will be over the age of 65. Chronic conditions, heart disease, diabetes, dementia require ongoing, expensive treatment. And new treatments, they cost more. Medical inflation is growing at twice the rate of general inflation. Rising staff wages, essential to retain talent, eat further into budgets, and pandemic backlogs have yet to be cleared. The system isn't just overwhelmed, it's outdated. As of 2023, 1 in 5 NHS buildings are classified as not fit for purpose. Leaking roofs, broken MRI machines, 1960s-era layouts. More than 4,500 serious infrastructure incidents were reported in the NHS last year, up from 1,200 in 2010. Hospitals are forced to close operating theaters due to water leaks. And the cost of this decay? The NHS now faces a £10.2 billion maintenance backlog, $1 billion of which is high risk, meaning it could directly endanger patient safety. But this isn't just about hospitals. Public services across Britain are under siege. Transport infrastructure? The HS2 high-speed rail project, once billed as the crown jewel of northern connectivity, has seen its budget balloon from £33 billion to over £100 billion before major segments were cancelled altogether in 2023. Across Britain, public services are no longer evolving, they are being triaged. All while expectations rise, populations age, and costs escalate. People experience the system as paperwork and queues. If time is a currency, services keep asking the public to pay more of it. It's not just that the NHS is crumbling, it's that it was allowed to, brick by brick, cut by cut, until the system itself became the emergency. And now the question isn't just whether it can be fixed, but whether it will survive. Crisis after crisis. Britain has borrowed its way through. 2008, the bank bailouts. £137 billion in emergency capital injections and guarantees to prevent systemic collapse after the global financial crisis. 2020, COVID relief. An extraordinary £376 billion package from furlough schemes to business grants. 2022, energy subsidies. A £69 billion program to shield households from the post-Ukraine invasion price surge. Each time, debt balloons. But here's the kicker. Debt isn't just debt anymore. It's expensive. With the Bank of England base rate now at 4% and peaking at 5.25%, the highest in over 15 years, the cost of servicing government debt has soared. In 2023 through 24, the UK spent £100 billion just on interest payments. That's more than the entire education budget and double the defense budget. And here's why it's worse than before. A quarter of debt is inflation-linked. The 2022 spike supercharged the interest bill. The Institute for Fiscal Studies warns that without either tax rises or deep spending cuts, Britain faces a permanent fiscal hole of at least £50 billion a year. And yet, the hasn't stopped. Net debt now sits at 97.8% of GDP, a level not seen since the early 1960s. The last time Britain carried this much debt, it was still paying off World War II. Debt isn't just a number on a spreadsheet, it's a bill that arrives every month. If a borrowing loop is left unchecked, it will not only decide Britain's finances, but Britain's future. Money is one constraint. Next comes the other: people. Britain's economy has a visible problem in its potholes, its waiting lists, its housing queues. But it also has an invisible problem, one that's quietly eroding its tax base, its productivity, and its future. Economic inactivity. Roughly 11 million people are missing from the workforce. The breakdown is stark. Around 2 million are full-time students. 3.5 million are long-term sick or early retired, a figure up 700,000 since before the pandemic. Over 1 million are unpaid carers, often looking after elderly relatives. The government doesn't class them as unemployed, but they're not working, which means fewer taxes, higher welfare costs, and lower economic output. The Office for Budget Responsibility warns that this inactivity could cost the UK £8 billion a year in lost GDP. And that's before factoring in the NHS burden. Nearly 2.8 million working-age adults are now economically inactive due to long-term illness, the highest level on record. To plug the gap, more immigration. Net migration hit 745,000 in 2022, bringing in the labor Britain can't supply itself. but immigration has become a political powder keg, fueling culture wars, protests, and policy reversals. A shrinking core workforce, an aging population, and a political system unwilling to confront the long-term fix. The demographic crisis is here. And then there's Brexit. It was sold as liberation, control restored, borders reclaimed. But for many sectors, it felt like isolation. Since leaving the European Union in January 2020, the UK's foreign direct investment has fallen by an estimated 25%, according to the Office for National Statistics. Major international firms have shifted operations to Dublin, Amsterdam, and Frankfurt to retain single market access. Trade has suffered too. Exports to the EU, the UK's largest trading partner, are now 15% lower than they would have been without Brexit, according to the Centre for European Reform's trade tracker. Small exporters, hit hardest by new customs checks and compliance costs, have abandoned EU markets entirely. Labor shortages have deepened. The end of free movement reduced the inflow of EU workers. SMEs struggle to hire where EU labor once flowed easily. Brexit didn't cause all of Britain's economic woes, but it magnified them, compounding supply chain disruptions, tightening the squeeze on labor, eroding competitiveness at a time when global trade rivals were expanding. The question isn't just what Britain left behind, it's what it has left to rebuild with. Once Britain was a land of opportunity, a place where each generation expected to live better than the one before. However, more than 60% of Brits say life was better in the 1990s and early 2000s. A recent Office for National Statistics survey found that overall life satisfaction has fallen to its lowest level since records began in 2011. Over 37% of respondents reported feeling rarely or never satisfied with life. In parallel, rates of clinical depression have nearly doubled since 2010, affecting 1 in 6 adults. This isn't just economic decline, it's cultural decay, an erosion of collective confidence. The psychological toll is harder to quantify than GDP, but it's just as real. Because when a nation stops believing in its own future, its decline is no longer measured only in numbers, but in the fading of its spirit. The absurdity of living in the UK isn't one dramatic collapse. It's a slow unraveling. 1,000 tiny failures, each manageable on its own, accumulating into systemic dysfunction. Expectations outran reality. Satisfaction down. Precarity up. Daily life feels like a squeeze with no off-ramp. What makes this truly dangerous is not that Britain is failing, but that people are adjusting by lowering the bar, quietly, resentfully. That is the final, most dangerous absurdity of all.